courtroom was packed, filled with whispers that blended into a steady hum of judgment. This wasn't some high-profile murder case, just a routine hearing, yet people had shown up in droves. They weren't here for justice, they were here for entertainment. And at the center of it all stood Zoe Caldwell, the 17-year-old black teenager they had already decided was guilty. Her sneakers made a faint squeak as she shifted her weight on the polished floor, but she remained still otherwise. She didn't fidget, didn't tremble, didn't look like someone terrified of the charges against her. Instead, she carried herself with a composure that felt almost unnatural for someone her age. But Judge Raymond Calloway wasn't buying it. Seated at the bench, his bulky frame stretched beneath his black robe, he peered down at her with a mixture of boredom and disdain. He flipped through her case file slowly, as if savoring the moment before he spoke. "Miss Caldwell," he finally said, dragging out her name like it was something unpleasant on his tongue. "Do you even understand what you're being accused of here?" The room fell silent. All eyes locked onto Zoe, waiting for her to break. She didn't flinch, didn't flinch back, didn't glance around for help. Instead, she met the judge's gaze with the same steady, fearless expression and answered, "Yes, Your Honor, I do." A scoff came from the judge as he leaned forward, his thick arms pressing into the bench. "You sure about that?" His tone dripped with condescension, thick with the assumption that she had no clue what she was doing. "Because this isn't some after-school debate club. This is a court of law, young lady." A few chuckles echoed from the gallery, feeding off the judge's amusement. Zoe let her eyes sweep the room, her gaze slow and deliberate, as if memorizing every face in the crowd. They looked at her like she was a joke, a curiosity, something to be watched rather than understood. But what they didn't realize was that she wasn't here to amuse them, she was here to win. The judge smirked, taking her silence as weakness, as confirmation that she was out of her depth. "That's what I thought," he muttered, shaking his head. "I don't know why they thought it was a good idea to let you speak on your own behalf. This isn't child's play, and you are not equipped for this." Zoe's lips parted slightly, as if she might respond. But then she stopped. Instead, a faint, knowing smile crept onto her face, subtle yet deliberate. The gallery shifted, as if sensing something had changed, though they couldn't quite put their finger on what. The judge mistook her quiet confidence for surrender and waved a dismissive hand. "Let's just get this over with," he said, his voice laced with impatience. "The prosecution may proceed." That was his first mistake. And before this hearing was over, he'd realized just how badly he had underestimated her. Assistant District Attorney Marcus Renner rose from his seat, adjusting the cuffs of his expensive gray suit. He was tall, sharp-jawed, and carried himself with the arrogance of a man who had never lost to someone who didn't have a law degree. His smirk mirrored the judge's, filled with the same unshakable confidence. "Your Honor, this is an open and shut case. The evidence speaks for itself." He began pacing, delivering his argument as though Zoe weren't even in the room. The defendant, a minor, was found at the scene in possession of materials clearly linking her to his words, were suddenly cut off. A single voice sliced through the courtroom, sharp, clear, and completely unexpected. "Objection." The prosecutor froze, his mouth still half open, his polished words abruptly derailed. The gallery erupted in whispers, people leaning toward each other in shock. Even Judge Calloway looked momentarily caught off guard before arching an eyebrow. "Objection," he repeated, his voice thick with sarcasm. His gaze bore into Zoe like a spotlight, waiting for her to crumble under the weight of her own defiance. "Miss Caldwell, do you even know what that means?" he asked, his amusement barely contained. Zoe remained unfazed, her tone as steady as ever. "Yes, Your Honor. The prosecution is making assumptions about my intent without providing context. That's speculative and inadmissible." A ripple of shock moved through the room, a wave of disbelief crashing against the assumptions everyone had made about her. The prosecutor blinked, clearly thrown off his game for the first time. He scrambled to recover, shaking his head as if trying to brush off what had just happened. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular." "No." Zoe interrupted again, her voice cutting clean through his like a blade. "What's irregular was the lack of actual evidence tying me to any criminal activity." Judge Calloway's gavel slammed down hard, the sound cracking through the tension. His expression darkened. Amusement gone. "That's enough," he snapped. His voice carried an edge of frustration now, his earlier smugness replaced with something more volatile. "Miss Caldwell, you are here to defend yourself, not to play lawyer. One more outburst like that, and I'll hold you in contempt." Still, Zoe's expression did not change. "Understood, Your Honor," she replied, her voice even, unshaken. prosecutor cleared his throat, adjusting his tie as he tried to regain control of the room. As I was saying, he began again, but Zoe was already a step ahead. "Permission to approach the bench," she said, her voice firm and unwavering. The room collectively gasped. The judge stared at her, his face twisting from irritation to full-blown disbelief. "You don't get to make demands in my courtroom," he barked. But Zoe did not back down. "I'm not making a demand, Your Honor," she countered. "I'm exercising my right to present a fair defense." Then she delivered the final blow. "But if you're not willing to hear me out, I'll file a motion for recusal due to judicial bias." The silence that followed was deafening. The gallery leaned in closer, some whispering furiously, others completely stunned. Even Judge Calloway looked momentarily speechless. He narrowed his eyes at her, studying her like she was some kind of puzzle he couldn't solve. "You think you're clever, don't you?" he finally said after a long pause. Slowly, Zoe let a small, sharp smile creep onto her lips. "I don't think, Your Honor," she replied smoothly. "I know." The power in the room shifted. For the first time since she had stepped foot into that courtroom, it was no longer the judge or the prosecutor who held control. It was her. And none of them, not the judge, not the ADA, not the gallery full of skeptics, were ready for what she was about to do next. Judge Calloway's glare deepened, but something flickered behind his eyes, something that hadn't been there before. He wasn't just irritated anymore. He was uncertain. He tapped his pen against the bench, weighing his next move carefully. Finally, he exhaled sharply and said, "Fine. Approach." The courtroom stirred, a wave of murmurs rippling through the crowd as Zoe stepped forward. Every movement was deliberate, every step filled with unshaken confidence. She wasn't just walking to the bench, she was claiming her ground. The prosecutor, Marcus Renner, sat stiffly, his smirk tightening as he watched her. Zoe placed a neatly stacked pile of documents on the judge's bench, her hands steady. "This is a preliminary review of the evidence submitted by the prosecution," she said, her voice smooth and controlled. The judge barely glanced at the pages before eyeing her with skepticism. "And where exactly did you get this?" She met his gaze without hesitation. "I prepared it myself, Your Honor," she answered. Judge Calloway hesitated for the first time, flipping through the pages with furrowed brows. His eyes darted between the documents and the young girl standing before him, as if trying to piece together a puzzle that didn't make sense. Across the room, Renner forced a laugh, his confidence clearly cracking. "Your Honor, this is absurd," he scoffed, trying to mask his unease. "She's clearly stalling. She can," Judge Calloway muttered, still flipping through the pages, cutting him off mid-sentence. The gallery leaned in, sensing the shift, their whispers growing louder. Renner's mouth opened, then closed, his frustration mounting as he realized the judge was actually considering Zoe's argument. "Your Honor, with all due respect, we cannot allow the defendant to she's right," the judge interrupted, his voice sharper now. Another wave of shock moved through the room as gasps and whispers filled the air. The prosecutor stiffened, his face momentarily blank before he forced another smirk. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular, no," Zoe cut in, her voice calm yet firm. "What's irregular is the lack of actual evidence tying me to any crime." Judge Calloway's gavel slammed down hard, demanding order as the tension thickened. His earlier amusement was gone, replaced by something far more serious. "Miss Caldwell," he said, his tone measured but no longer dismissive, "where exactly did you learn how to construct something like this?" Zoe didn't blink as she answered, "I read." The weight of her words hung in the air, pressing down on everyone in the room. The whispers stopped, replaced the silence thick with disbelief. The judge exhaled, rubbing his temple, as if trying to make sense of what was happening. Adia Renner clenched his jaw, his frustration boiling over. "This is ridiculous," Renner snapped, turning to the judge with renewed urgency. "She's a child, not an attorney. We're wasting time entertaining this. You assumed I wouldn't fight back." Zoe interrupted, her voice cutting through his like a blade. "You assumed I'd stand here, scared, while you bulldozed through a case full of holes." Renner turned back to Judge Calloway, his face flushing. "Your Honor, we cannot let enough," Calloway interrupted, his voice sharp, eyes locked on Zoe. There was no denying it now. He wasn't just looking at a teenage girl. He was looking at something he hadn't seen before. The judge inhaled deeply, then leaned forward. "Miss Caldwell," he said, voice quieter now, "what exactly are you trying to prove here?" Zoe straightened, her confidence unshaken. "That I'm not just a teenager standing trial," she said slowly, letting the words sink in. The gallery held their breath, waiting for what came next. "I'm an attorney," she finished, her voice clear and strong. The courtroom exploded. Gasps, murmurs, outright exclamations of disbelief erupted all at once. Judge Calloway's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing in pure shock. Renner froze, his jaw visibly tightening, his knuckles white against the table. Someone in the gallery dropped their pen, the sound oddly loud in the chaos. The tension in the room reached its breaking point. Renner slammed his hand down on the table, his voice rising. "Your Honor, this is absurd. She's clearly lying." "I'm not," Zoe countered smoothly. "I passed the California bar exam last year. You can look me up." Zoe Caldwell, licensed attorney. Judge Calloway turned sharply to his clerk. "Verify that," he ordered, his voice curt, his expression unreadable. The room fell into a heavy silence except for the rapid clicking of the clerk's keyboard. Every second stretched unbearably long as the entire courtroom waited. Finally, the clerk looked up, her eyes wide. "It's true," she said, barely above a whisper. Zoe Caldwell is a registered attorney with the State Bar of California. The courtroom erupted again. Some people clapped. Others whispered furiously. A few stood up, shaking their heads in disbelief. The gavel slammed down again hard. "Order." Judge Calloway barked, though even he looked shaken. His voice, when he spoke again, had lost its earlier sarcasm. "You're telling me," he began slowly, "that you're a licensed attorney at your age?" "Yes, Your Honor," Zoe answered, her voice unwavering. "I graduated high school early, earned my degree, passed the bar, and now," she gestured around, "I'm here." The prosecutor's face turned red, a mix of fury and humiliation. The entire room had turned against him. Renner sputtered, his words struggling to find air. "This is highly irregular. She shouldn't even be allowed to." "She's allowed," the judge interrupted, his voice steady, but lower now. His posture had changed. He was no longer dismissing her, he was considering her. Zoe tilted her head slightly, her knowing smile returning. "You underestimated me, Your Honor," she said. "A lot of people in this room did. But I'm not here to play games, I'm here to win." Another ripple of murmurs spread through the gallery, but no one laughed this time. Judge Calloway leaned forward, lacing his fingers together. "All right, Miss Caldwell," he said, his voice measured but no longer dismissive. "You've got everyone's attention. Let's see if you can back it up." Zoe nodded once, inhaling steadily. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said, turning toward Renner, whose smirk had completely disappeared. The real battle was just beginning. Zoe turned to A.A. Marcus Renner, her eyes sharp, unshaken. He was still standing, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, his jaw clenched so hard it looked like his teeth might crack. The once smug prosecutor, the man who thought this case would be over in minutes, was now visibly rattled. She had him exactly where she wanted him. Judge Calloway sat back in his chair, tapping his fingers against the bench. "All right, Miss Caldwell," he said, his voice quieter now but carrying a new edge of curiosity. "You've made quite the spectacle, but let's see if you can actually deliver. Proceed with your defense." Zoe nodded, her voice calm but commanding. "Thank you, Your Honor. Let's start with Exhibit B, the surveillance footage. The prosecution claims ties me to the scene of the crime." She walked back to her table, picking up a file and holding it up for the court to see. Renner leaned forward, trying to mask his frustration. "The footage clearly shows you at the scene," he snapped. Zoe met his gaze unshaken. "It shows someone who looks like me near the scene," she corrected. "But what you conveniently failed to mention, intentionally or not, is that the timestamp is missing." Judge Calloway's head snapped toward Renner. "Is that true?" The prosecutor hesitated, his lips pressing into a thin line. "The footage is still reliable," he insisted. Zoe's lips curled into a small smile. "Is it?" she asked, tilting her head. She stepped forward, placing another document onto the bench. "This is a forensic analyst's report outlining multiple inconsistencies in the video file. The footage was also retrieved from an unverified source, violating the chain of custody. Legally speaking, Your Honor, this evidence should be inadmissible." The courtroom shifted, people whispering, exchanging stunned glances. Judge Calloway skimmed the report, his frown deepening. He turned to Renner, his eyes sharper now. "Ada Renner, do you have a response to this?" Renner's face darkened as he grabbed the paper, scanning it with growing frustration. "This is just a distraction," Renner said through gritted teeth. "The defendant, Attorney Caldwell," Zoe corrected smoothly, making sure everyone in the room heard her title. The gallery stirred, a few even nodding in approval. Renner exhaled sharply. "Attorney Caldwell," he said, the words clearly bitter in his mouth, was still present near the scene. Regardless of the footage, we also have Exhibit D, the signed confession. Zoe smirked. She had been waiting for this. Let's talk about Exhibit D, Zoe said, walking back to her table and picking up another file. According to the prosecution, this so-called confession was signed after hours of questioning. She let the words sink in before continuing. Your Honor, under federal law, a minor is entitled to legal representation during an interrogation. I was questioned without an attorney present. The judge's eyebrows shot up. He turned to Renner. Is this true? Renner opened his mouth, but Zoe kept going. Not only was I questioned without a lawyer, but the confession is riddled with inaccuracies. Let's take the address listed on the statements, Listom, for example. She picked up another paper and held it up. This is my official address from the last 3 years. The one listed on the confession? She let the courtroom wait, building the tension. Completely wrong. I never lived there. It's public record. The whispers in the courtroom louder. Renner's face turned a deep shade of red as he flipped through his own files, clearly scrambling for an explanation. Judge Calloway exhaled sharply, rubbing his temple. ADA Renner, do you care to explain why this document contains incorrect information? Renner stammered, flipping pages like the answer might magically appear. I don't know how that error got in there. You don't, Zoe cut in, her voice still calm. Because you didn't do your homework. The gallery shifted, murmurs turning into full-blown disbelief. She took another step forward, her presence commanding the entire courtroom now. This case was built on flawed evidence and lazy assumptions. The prosecution thought I'd be an easy win, someone who wouldn't fight back, but they were wrong. Renner slammed his hands onto the table. Your Honor, this is ridiculous. What's ridiculous? Zoe said, her voice stronger now, is that you thought you could get away with it. Judge Calloway's fingers drummed against his desk as he sat deep in thought. The tension in the room was so thick, you could cut it with a knife. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he leaned forward. I've seen a lot in my years on the bench, he said, his voice quieter now. But I have never seen anything quite like this. Renner looked hopeful for a second, as if the judge might still side with him. But then Calloway shook his head. It's clear to me that there are significant issues with this case. He turned to Renner, his gaze sharp. The chain of custody for Exhibit B is compromised. Exhibit D is inadmissible due to clear violations of the defendant's rights. The gavel slammed down hard. I have no choice but to dismiss these pieces of evidence. The courtroom erupted. Some people gasped, others murmured, and a few shook their heads in complete disbelief. Renner looked like he might actually explode. Your Honor, with all due respect, Calloway cut him off. You should have done your job better. The judge turned to Zoe, his expression unreadable for a long moment. Then finally he spoke. Miss Caldwell, he said, his voice less harsh now. I must admit I misjudged you. I assumed you were just a kid out of her depth. I was wrong. Zoe let his words sit in the air before responding. Thank you, Your Honor, she said, her voice steady. But this isn't about me. This is about holding the justice system to a higher standard. The judge gave a small nod before delivering his final decision. Based on the lack of credible evidence and the procedural errors brought to light, I have no choice but to dismiss this case. Miss Caldwell, you are free to go. For a moment, Zoe just stood there letting it all sink in. The courtroom exploded again, some in applause, some in outrage. But none of it mattered. She had won. She gathered her papers, her head held high. As she walked down the aisle, people parted for her, their eyes following her every step. Some looked at her with awe, others with newfound respect. Outside the courthouse, a reporter rushed up, microphone in hand. Miss Caldwell, how did you pull this off? What's your secret? Zoe stopped, turning to face the camera directly. There's no secret, she said. The law is meant to serve everyone, not just those who fit a certain mold. She let her words linger, looking straight into the lens. People like me, young, black. Underestimated, we are capable of more than you think. Then, without another word, she walked away. Behind her, the murmurs continued, the whispers of a girl who had changed everything. And for the first time, Zoe didn't have to prove herself to anyone, because she already had. People will underestimate you, that's a fact. They will look at your age, your background, your appearance, and decide who you are before you even open your mouth. They will assume you're not smart enough, not strong enough, not worthy enough to stand in the same room as them. And if you let them define you, you've already lost. But here's the truth. The only person who gets to decide your worth is you. Zoe Caldwell wasn't supposed to win. She wasn't supposed to fight back. But she did, and she won, not just because she was smart, but because she refused to silence. She knew her value. She knew her rights. And when the world told her she wasn't good enough, she proved them wrong. Life will throw obstacles at you. People will doubt you, dismiss you, and try to break you. Let them. Because when you finally stand up, when you fight for what you know is right, there is no force in the world that can stop you. So don't wait for permission to be great. Be bold. Be relentless. And most of all, never let anyone tell you what you can or cannot be.